So for the final drawing project of the semester, it's now your turn to draw a face where you're not following along step by step with me. So the first thing you want to do is choose the person that you're going to draw. And the specifics can be found here under the face drawing unit. If we go down, I also call it the portrait project. So there's an example of someone, they took this photo and this is the image that they created. So what was the learning goal? So again, using the principle of proportion, you're going to block out a realistic adult human face. We've looked at how to correctly draw in all the forms and how to use value and texture to create a fully rendered realistic portrait. Okay, so what's the task? Again, use a photo as reference. If you have a printer at home, it's a lot easier to print out a black and white picture if you can. I know I can't, so I'm always just drawing off an iPad. But if you can print one out, then you can actually draw the lines right onto the photo in order to help you with the math. Okay, so again, try to use a straight-on image. Try to make it someone who's an adult because I said the proportions of little kids are different, and little kids are really hard to render. If you ever decide you want to render a little kid, the trick is barely shade any of the skin. All right, always include a little bit of the clothing. When we look at the examples, you'll see that they've just gone down a little bit into the chest area because if not, you end up with this chopped off looking head that's kind of weird. All right. You really need to spend time on the hair, so it takes layers to make it look realistic. The other thing is you need to watch your edges, like the last lesson that I had put up, no outlines, but also nothing too fuzzy either. So if I go back up onto the website right here into face drawing exemplars, all right, so we look at some examples that have been done by previous grade 9 students. So this is a really great example. You can tell just by looking at it that the proportions are correct. The other thing I wanted to point out, when I talked about generic proportions, and then I started to talk about, like, when we talked about eyelids, and that it depends on your ethnicity, whether you have deep set eyelids or not. I talked about in the bridge of the nose. It depends on your ethnic origins, whether this area is flat or it protrudes out a lot. The other thing that you'll find is the proportion of the nose being halfway between in the chin and the eyes. That's a much more Western Caucasian proportion. So obviously because his mouth is open, that changes it a bit too. But you can clearly tell that the nose, so especially at African American faces is when I notice it the most, that proportion changes. So when you're looking at someone's face, you need to, again, don't just assume that it's the proportions we discussed. Those were kind of generic ones to get you going, but you need to copy them off that person's face. So this has got the math is done correctly. The shading is beautiful on this. And one of the things that makes it work so well is how dark they've made the clothing, because that really adds to the contrast and makes the whole picture overall look better. Here's another example, and this is a great example of, obviously the other one didn't have any hair, of showing you how many layers it takes to make that hair look realistic. This is also a really good example for showing how to do freckles on someone's face, and freckles are something that it's probably easier to do if you just use a smudgy. The shading on this is beautiful. And I also love the shading on the shirt. Adding texture onto the clothing can really help your drawing. But even if the photo you're using doesn't have dark clothing or textured clothing, you can always find a different picture and swap that out. So here's a couple of examples of not as successful images. Okay, so the first obvious problem with this one is they forgot to check the width of the face to the height of the face. And when you're doing that, you got to remember, from one side of the face to the other side of the face should be the same as from the chin to right about here, right about the middle of the forehead. And this person forgot to do that because the side of the face is actually right about here. So that's the issue. The other problem with this is because there's no shading really over here at the side, the face isn't bending back in space. It looks really flat. And the other thing that happened is the hair is very cartoony. And it's too bad because they spent a lot of time on this hair. But they've kind of missed a lot of the detailing of it, and that creates a cartoon look. Also, the outline around the mouth is just too much as well. The nose isn't really soft enough, and this part up here, I said you've got to get a shadow in this area or this area in order to make the top of the nose stick out. If not, it creates this really flat look to the face. And one last one is, this was just an example of a lot of things kind of going wrong on this picture. First of all, yeah, hair lines can't go straight across. Remember when I talked about hair, you've always got to remember it's a sphere. So even if someone has this hair, it would go like this. It would go up, over, and back down this way. It's got to wrap around. The other thing that's happening is the tear ducts. The inner part of your eye, you have to have that little tear duct there. You can't just go to a corner. On the nose, this is that problem that they just suddenly stopped shading. So they like colored in the nostrils where instead of going from dark slowly to light to let it blend in, they just kind of colored right around. The other thing that happens is this neck is way, way too long. Your collarbone is right about here. So again, watch that when you're doing the neck. Also, it's you know, they've kind of got it a little bit skinnier than it should be. It should be just right out here, but it has to bend out at that point. So make sure you're taking a look at your reference and make sure you're following the correct proportions.